What buddy? It is your boy Alking21 here, and we are back for another Heimler's history review. Let us figure out how we're gonna configure this camera first. Okay. Okay. I don't like that. We apologize until we remember it's Mr. Lee. And then I realized, wait a minute, he's the one who has me doing this. But it's for extra credit. So actually, Mr. Lee, you the GOAT. Shout out to my boy Elias for staying with me at school for Unit 1, 2, and 3. Because if you don't remember, 3, 4, and 5. Because if you don't remember, we started off with 3, 4, 5. And now we're going to do 1 and 2 now that I'm home. Let's see the angle. Okay, you can see the paper. Can you see me? No, you cannot. Let's zoom it out. This is better. Hold on, we gotta do the Schrodinger's angle method. You leave your hand here. I don't know. I don't know if you can see me. I don't know if me turning my head is necessary. Mr. Lee, you've turned me into a deranged maniac. I'm really tired. I have rehearsals until 7 today. So, let's get on with it. Units 1 and 2.
There we go. Hey! Welcome to the AP Government Review live stream. It is, 2 nights before the exam, and we are going to same place. So, after I'll down, it has become, get those, and so one is, we can joke for this is sad because it's true. Okay. I don't know. I'm in the mood for one more, and then we'll jump right in. When I was in elementary school, all my friends, it was weird. I mean, they all talked about picking their nose, and I thought that was weird because I was born with mine. I was born with mine. Hope you enjoyed that. All right, now let's get into the fun stuff. We're going to start with Unit 1. And by the way, one thing I didn't say is that if you do send in a super chat for me to shout out somebody or, whatever, I'm not going to be answering any questions like content-wise. I want to just keep it to shout-outs so that, the content gets a little crazy. They have to be submitted before 8:30. And I'll read anything submitted before 8:30. So that's all. That's it. Now, let's go ahead and get ourselves to Unit 1.
I don't know if you can see Mr. Lee. I'm going to assume that yes.
Let's get to Unit 1. So, Unit 1, the title is Foundations of American Democracy. And I'm going to run through this according to several big ideas. Each unit is broken down into several big ideas. And those are what are on your note guides there. So, Unit 1, big idea number 1. And by the way, you'll see that there's 9 big ideas for this unit, okay? So, big idea number 1. You feeling good? Our foundational governing documents are deeply influenced by Enlightenment thought. Okay, now, when it comes to Enlightenment thought, there are really 4 big ideas that you need to be familiar with. Number 1, natural rights. Number 2, popular sovereignty. Number 3, the social contract. Number 4, republicanism. So natural rights, people are given political rights not by a political ruler like a king, but instead by a creator. They are endowed with them just by virtue of existing. Popular sovereignty. The right to govern is in the hands of the people. That's what popular means. And not in some sort of hereditary kingship, monarchy, etc. Social contract is the idea that the people who are being ruled are doing so. They are allowing themselves to be ruled. They give their consent to be ruled over by this governing authority. And if that governing authority turns out to be a turd, then the people have the right to overthrow that government and establish a new one that serves their needs. And then republicanism is a form of government that is chiefly characterized by the separation of political power. And in terms of the Enlightenment thought of republicanism, we've got the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And by separating powers like that, it provides a check against political tyranny. Okay? So, you put all those things in a pot. You start stirring it up. Take a big whiff of that nice aroma. What you're going to get is limited government. That's the main idea of our form of government in the United States. Is it is a limited government. It is limited by the laws that are passed. It is limited by the powers to check and balance each branch that exists. And that idea is illustrated in two of your foundational documents. These are the required documents. So, number one, these ideas are illustrated in the Declaration of Independence. So, in the Declaration of Independence, it says that human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's a perfect example of the idea of natural rights. Okay. It
I
also
remember
says
that.
when
Thanks,
a
Jerry.
government
You don't
becomes
have to ask.
destructive of those ends,
Appreciate
that it's the right of those people to replace it. Okay, that's the social contract. It also says that government exists by the consent of the governed. Let me keep hitting this. By the consent of the governed. That's the idea of popular sovereignty. Okay, the second document in which these ideas are illustrated is the Constitution. So the Constitution essentially is a blueprint for a republican form of government. Okay, it lays out how powers are going to be separated. It lays out how the people's voice is going to be represented in that government, and we're going to talk all about that as we go. But for now, let's move on to big idea number two. Different models of democracy are visible in our nation and its policies. Okay, models of democracy. Let's talk about them. There are three models of democratic participation that you need to know. Number one is participatory democracy. Okay, the idea here is that we want as many people as possible involved in the political process, which is kind of what the name sounds like. It's participatory. We want everybody here in the party. On the opposite end of the scale, you've got elite democracy, which wants as few people as possible involved in the political process. You know, historically, that's been certain races, landowners, that sort of thing.
Agarrando comida.
That's elite. And then somewhere in the
Porque
middle,
tengo
the pluralist
no rehearsals
model of democracy.
más tarde.
Groups of people associate with various interest groups who then compete to influence policy, laws, etc. Now, you need to understand how those three models are represented in three of your required foundational documents. Okay, so let's go back to the Constitution. In the Constitution, you got flavors of all three of these models of democracy. So, as an example of elite democracy, the Constitution provides for elected representatives that legislate on behalf of their people. Like, it's not just a mass democracy where all people vote on everything. No, it's a very clear example of elite democracy where it's our representatives who are doing the work of legislation and not the people themselves. An example of pluralist democracy in the Constitution would be that, you know, in order to pass legislation, that requires compromise from various groups of, you know, competing interests, like states or factions or whatever. And then an example of participatory democracy in the Constitution is that states make their own laws, you know, as long as they don't conflict with federal laws, you know. And this is important, the further down you go on the ladder, like from federal to state to local to municipal, etc., the more local it gets, the more participatory democracy becomes. Okay. Now, this you can also, that's how those three models are demonstrated in the Constitution. Now let's see how they're demonstrated in the sort of the debate between two other documents, Brutus 1 and Federalist 10. So, Brutus championed a broad participatory model, and the reason why is because he, the writer here feared the curtailment of personal liberties reflected in a much larger republic. But then in Federalist 10, Madison argues that, he grants the point, yes, it's a large nation, lots of very different kinds of people, but he argues that with so many competing factions in such a big republic, everybody's going to have to fight and negotiate and compromise, and in that way, liberty would be upheld. Okay? And that brings us to a big idea number 3. Federalists and anti-federalists argued over the proper scope of federal power. Okay, so if you haven't heard of the Federalists, well, I hope you have. The Federalists, they favored strong central government. Okay, so the Constitution was a Federalist creation. Well, they were the ones mainly arguing for it. And they argued for it in a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. I already just talked about Federalist 10, which is one of your required documents, one of your foundational documents. And the main argument in Federalist 10 is how to mitigate, in Madison's words, the mischief of factions. Okay, so his solution in Federalist 10 was, okay, we can do one of two things. One, we can take away the causes of faction. And what are the causes of faction? The causes of faction are free thought and people having different ideas and having to battle them out. So if you want to get rid of that kind of argumentation, you can take away. He's trying to argue that if it's going to erode people's liberty, okay, then you could take away the causes of faction. You can take away free thought, or you can mitigate the effects of that free thought in those debates. So that's ultimately what he argues for. He says, with so many factions in the U.S., they're going to be forced to cooperate since none of these factions is big enough to dominate the entire nation. Okay, that's the basic argument in Federalist number 10. So that's the Federalists. They argued for the Constitution. They wanted a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, excuse me, they favored a weak central government and a series of strong state governments. The reason why is because their main concern was they wanted to avoid the tyranny that Americans experienced under the monarchy and during the colonial period. Okay, so in Brutus 1, another of your foundational documents, Brutus's beef is essentially, in the Constitution, there's something called the Necessary and Proper Clause. There's something called the Supremacy Clause. We'll talk more about those later. But he's basically saying these are illustrations of how a stronger central government can tyrannize the states and the local levels. And he basically says that a large centralized government could not adequately represent the interest of a nation so big and so diverse as the United States of America. And that brings us to big idea number 4. We're cooking. See about some water here. All right, big idea number. Lost my mouse. Big idea number 4. The Articles of Confederation failed because federal power was too weak and state power was too great. Okay, the Articles of Confederation was the first Constitution of the United States post-Revolution, or during Revolution, and it was a hot mess. But there is one thing it was really good at, and that was to avoid the tyranny of the centralized state. Okay, remember, I just said this is what Brutus was arguing against. They did not. None of the former colonists enjoyed being pressed under the thumb of Big Mama Britain, but and so when they created the Articles of Confederation, that was their chief end: is we need to avoid centralized power as much as possible. And so the Articles of Confederation very much did that. Okay. And that's about the best thing that we can say about the Articles of Confederation, because there were many, many significant weaknesses, and I'm only going to mention a few. First of all, there was, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch. There was no judicial branch. There was only a Congress, okay? Additionally, Congress had no power to raise direct taxes on the people. So, they're broke, they can't pay their bills. Another weakness is that in order to change the Articles of Confederation or to amend it, it required a unanimous vote from all 13 states. It was impossible back then, as it would be today, to get everybody in the United States to agree on a thing. And so that was a serious, even if there were weaknesses and everybody agreed that there were, you can't change the dang thing. So that was a serious weakness. Also, under the Articles, the Congress had no power to raise or maintain a national army, and that had a significant consequence. And that consequence came in something called Shays' Rebellion. And I'm not going to go too far into what it is, but a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts got upset because some of them were veterans from the American Revolution. And remember what I said earlier? Congress couldn't pay their bills. And so these veterans weren't getting paid. And so they went ahead and started up a nice little rebellion. The Massachusetts militia ultimately shut it down fairly easily. But the point was, it showed everybody that the Articles of Confederation was not a sufficient governing document because there was no federal army. There's no way to respond in force on a federal level. Every state just had to do their own thing. Okay? So the big thing you really need to remember about Shays' Rebellion is that it was that event that really was the catalyst for the exposing the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and creating the path for the Constitutional Convention, which leads us on to big idea number 5. The U.S. Constitution was created and ratified as a result of several compromises between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Okay, so they sit in a sweaty room in Philadelphia, and they hammer out a bunch of ideas for a new constitution. The Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, they're arguing with each other, and ultimately what had to happen in order to get this document written is that there had to be some very significant compromises, and there's a few of these compromises that you're going to need to know. So first of all, there was the Great Compromise. It's also known as the Connecticut Compromise. Basically, this one was about representation. How would the people's voice be represented in this new government? And the result, there was the Kentucky plan, there was the New Jersey plan, etc. But ultimately what they got to was that in order to be represented in this new nation, we're going to have a bicameral legislature. Okay, so 2 houses in Congress, we've got the House of Representatives, we got the Senate. We will talk about them ad nauseum in Unit 2. So get excited for that. Second compromise that you need to remember is how the president is going to be elected, and that is the compromise of the Electoral College. Okay? Basically, the result was each state is given electors equal to their congressional representatives, and those electors are the ones who elect the president. Okay? Another example of elite democracy. Maybe I said that earlier. I can't remember, but there it is again. Another key compromise that you need to remember is the 3/5 compromise. This one's huge because basically this was a compromise that was hammered out over how enslaved people were going to be counted for representation. I'm not going to get into the whole debate, but ultimately the result of that compromise was that 3/5 of the enslaved population would count toward representation in the House, and it was that particular compromise that gave the South outsized power up through the Civil War. Okay, so that was political power to the South. Without the 3/5 compromise, they would have been trounced politically in the beginning of the first half of the 19th century. But the 3/5 compromise gave them enormous amounts of political power that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Now, also in the Constitution, because the debates and the resulting compromises and the debates that that forged those compromises were so intense, they put in a process into the Constitution for amending it. Okay, remember the Articles of Confederation? It was almost impossible to amend the articles, but so they learned from that, and so in Article 5 of the Constitution, it lays out how do we amend the Constitution? How do we change it if we need to? Well, there's a two-stage process. The first part is a proposal. The second part is ratification. So in the proposal stage, an amendment can be proposed either by Congress or by the states if they call a special convention, and then in the ratification phase, 3/4 of state legislatures or state ratifying conventions have to agree that this is now a new amendment, and that's basically how it goes. And that's much easier. It's still hard to do, but it's much easier than it was under the Articles of Confederation. All right, let's go. Unit 6. Unit 1, big idea. 6. The U.S. Constitution lays out a system of government characterized by separation of powers and checks and balances. Okay, now let's take a little tour through Federalist 51, which illustrates and provides the justification for this big idea. The main idea of Federalist 51, and you have to know this, you're probably going to see it on your exam somewhere. The main idea of Federalist 51 is arguing for the separation of powers in the government and checks and balances between those branches in order to control abuses of power by majorities. Okay, so what Madison argues in Federalist 51, the solution to keeping those abuses of power in check is that each branch of government, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, they have to be made to work as independently as possible and to have certain powers to check the abuses of the others. Okay, so here's how it worked in the Constitution. Federalist 51 lays out the grounding argument for it. Here's how it actually laid out. We got 3 branches, right? The legislative, executive, judicial. The legislative branch is the one who makes the laws. The executive branch is the one who executes the laws or makes sure that everybody is obeying the laws. And then the judicial branch evaluates the constitutionality of the laws, okay? Now, each branch is going to be able to restrain or check the other branches. But we're going to talk, there's a whole topic on that in Unit 2, so put that in your pocket. We'll come back to it. But for now, let's go on to I keep saying Unit. Big idea number 7. All right. Our system of government is based on federalism, and the sharing of power is affected by societal needs. Okay, federalism, this is a big one. You're absolutely going to see this one on your exam, so get excited for that. So federalism. Hope you're still not confused by this one. If so, here's the definition. It's a system of government that is characterized by the sharing of power between national and state governments. Okay? Federalism is all about sharing power between the national government and the state government. Okay? It's not, has nothing to do with, it's so confusing because federalism sounds like the federal government. It's not that. Okay? It's not about federal power. It's about the sharing of power between Washington, D.C. and all the state governments. Okay? Now, when it comes to federalism and that sharing of powers, there are the Constitution, excuse me, the Constitution actually lays out certain kinds of powers for each of the branches of government. Okay, there are 3 that you're going to need to know. There are exclusive powers, there are reserved powers, and there are concurrent powers. All right. So exclusive powers are those powers that are delegated by the Constitution to the federal government. And an example of this would be, minting currency. So all the states have the same kind of currency. Another exclusive power for the federal government and Congress would be the declaration of war. Okay, only Congress can declare war, and so basically, these exclusive powers for Congress, it's everything outlined in Article 1, Section 8, okay? Then there are reserved powers, okay? These are powers that belong exclusively to the states, and that's provided for by the 10th Amendment, okay? So, any power that is not explicitly given to the federal government by the Constitution, 10th Amendment says, is reserved for the states. That's why they call them reserved powers. So these are things like police powers, education. It's gotten a little fuzzy over time, but education, elections, all these sorts of things. Those are reserved powers that belong to the states. And then there is the middle of the Venn diagram, which are concurrent powers. These are powers that are shared by federal and state governments. And so this is sort of the grist for the mill of how federalism works. There are some things that only the federal government does. There are some things that only the state governments do. But then there are some things that are shared. There are some powers that are shared. Now, and it's in that sharing that federalism works out. Now, in modern history, the way federalism has mainly worked is through something known as fiscal federalism. And that's the sharing of political power between the national and state governments, but through dollars, okay? And this happens, in lots of ways, but there's a couple that you need to know. First of all, fiscal federalism plays out through grants, okay? There's categorical grants. You're gonna need to know a couple of examples of how these different kinds of grants. There's categorical grants. These are grants that are given to states that, just basically as long as they comply with specific federal standards. And so that means that these are grants, these categorical grants, these are grants with strings attached, okay? So the federal government is handing the states money, saying you only get this money if you obey these particular criteria, okay? Then there are block grants. This is money given for relatively broad purpose, and this money can be used as the state sees fit. And in this case, there are very few strings attached. Okay, so for example, if the federal government gives a state a bunch of money and says, use this money on crime prevention, like that's it. You guys know more about your crime problems or whatever than we do. Here's a bunch of money, crime prevention, just go. Okay, so that would be very few strings attached, and that's a block grant. And then there are mandates. This is another way that federalism has worked out recently. A mandate requires a state to follow federal directives, but often compliance with those directives is very far beyond a state budget capacity. So the federal government then funds those mandates in the states. So a good example here would be the environmental standards of the Clean Air Act. Okay, this provided national standards for the reduction of smog and acid rain and other kinds of pollution. And in order to comply with that law, the states didn't have that kind of budget to retool their factories and the ways they create emissions and that sort of thing. And so the mandate was the federal law, and so then the federal government came in to fund those and help them out. All right, final big idea for Unit 1. Let's go. Wait. It says 9. Do I have 9? We'll see how it goes. I think it's only 8. Okay. Big idea number 8. The balance of power between states and the federal government has changed over time, and at the heart of that balancing act are a few constitutional provisions and 2 SCOTUS cases. All right. So let's talk about the constitutional provisions first for the balance of power. First of all, 10th Amendment, we already talked about that. Any powers not explicitly given to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved for the states. Okay? Then one big amendment for the sharing of power is the 14th Amendment. Basically, this amendment applies the Bill of Rights to the states. And so, states now have to guarantee the same privileges and immunities for its citizens and, the equal protection of the law that is enjoyed by all Americans at the federal level. Again, talk all about that in Unit 3. We'll leave it there. There's also the Commerce Clause, which the federal government is used to, regulate. I mean, the purpose of it is to regulate commerce among the states, but that has also been a clause that has been used to either deliver power to the states or take it back to the federal government. Again, we'll talk more about that, but just stick it in your brain fold for now. Then there's the necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause. This is a huge, this is one that has been fought over all sorts of ways. But basically, it says that Congress can make any law which upholds its enumerated powers. Like even if that power is not explicitly mentioned in Article 1, Section 8. Okay? The probably most famous example here is the creation of Alexander Hamilton's National Bank during the first presidential administration of George Washington. There was a whole lot of back and forth over that, and we'll talk more about that later, and maybe tomorrow. Okay, so 2 SCOTUS cases that you need Supreme Court of the United States, just in case that term is not familiar to you. 2 SCOTUS cases that show the way the balance of power has shifted over time. Number 1, McCulloch v. Maryland. Okay, the ruling here was that the necessary and proper clause implied that certain powers, like even if they're not explicitly stated, and the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause, both of those together meant that federal law trumped state law. Okay, federal law, because McCulloch v. Maryland, federal law is going when federal law and state law disagree, federal law wins. Okay. Second case, United States.
We have a crossover.
Here, Congress tried to use the Commerce Clause to try to regulate guns in schools. It's a crazy story that we're not going to get into, but
Hi,
the
Mr.
Supreme
Lee.
Court decided that
You're
carrying
kind of
guns
crazy
to
for
school
doing this.
like
And if you watch
you would
this,
think, in no way related to interstate
tell
commerce. And
Alex
so that they declared the law unconstitutional.
that
and
I
that
was the
provided
best
a rule
student
for
ever.
state power.
Oh, he already said that's not true.
And I do not have another
Just
big
kidding.
one, so let's call that the end of Unit 1.
Nothing, yo te tengo que ver nada.
We did it, guys.
Yeah.
We did it. All right.
Shut up, Ale.
And then you vamos a ver.
when I was 9, she got me like a bowl of mac and cheese with
Give yourself a
chicken
high
from
five.
Hungry Chicks.
I think I'll read
Alright,
while we're
Mr. Lee, you're gonna get a mukbang because I'm not gonna stop eating for you.
And by the way, if you do want me to shout out somebody, it's so helpful if you put the
I have restoration.
so I know how
Okay.
to say it because your name, man, it's
Come
like
on.
music to when you hear your own name. It's like music to your ears. I don't want to say it right, but you never know. So yeah, let me just read a few of these.
Porque sí está loco, pero todavía esto es mi tiempo de estudiar para mi examen mañana.
Mr. Dunn, so SR Duke, Old Bridge. Let's move on to Unit 2.
What?
Unit 2 is a big mama. So let's get going. All right. Big idea number 1. There are 12, in fact, 12 big ideas here. So, gird thyself. Here we go. Big idea number 1. The main work of Congress is to make laws. Sounds simple. Not always that simple. Okay. Okay, so first of all, you need to know, where does Congress get its power? Congress gets its power from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So there are enumerated powers, which, these are powers that are explicitly listed in Section 8. These are the expressed powers. Among those would be authority over federal money. This is what's known as the power of the purse. So Congress is able to raise revenue, pass the federal budget, etc. Congress also has foreign policy and military legislation under their purview. The most important among those is that it is Congress's constitutional job to declare war. Because that was important to them, because as in a Republican government where power is in the hands of the people, the people, the representatives of the people were the ones who got to say whether or not the nation went to war or not, and bled and died and spent a bunch of money, etc. So that's Congress's power. Then they've got other powers in there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they can determine the naturalization process in which people become citizens. They regulate interstate commerce, etc., etc. So those are the expressed powers of Congress. Now, there are also implied powers. These are the powers that come from that necessary and proper clause that I said we're going to get back to. I said put it in your pocket. Well, I'll get it right back out because we're going to talk about it. So with the implied powers, Congress can pass a whole range of legislation addressing any kind of economic or environmental or social issues, even if they are not explicitly mentioned in Article 1, Section 8. Okay? And we talked about that in the last unit, so we'll leave it there. The second thing you need to understand about Congress and how they do their work and make their laws is the structure of Congress, and that is, as I mentioned, bicameral. So that's also laid out in Article 1 of the Constitution. You got two houses. The first is the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, the representatives of the people are apportioned by population of each state. Okay, so there are 435 at this point. There are 435 voting representatives in Congress, and those are there are more from some states and there are less from others because it's all depending on population. Now, if it was just by population, there should be more than 435, but it was legally capped at 435, so that's as far as they're going until they vote to uncap it or just leave it like that. So that's the House of Representatives. In the Senate, there are 2 representatives per state. Okay, and they represent the whole state. You see, in the House of Representatives, those representatives represent parts of the state, but the senators, they represent the entire state. So if there are 2 senators per state, and there are 50 states, doing some rough math in my head, that's 100 senators. And so, with the House and the what's the other one? The Senate, they have to work together in order to pass legislation. Both houses need to participate in order to pass legislation, and they've got to pass identical bills, and then those are passed on to the president. Now let's look at big idea number 2. The leadership structures of Congress and the committee system are the main avenues through which Congress does its work. So let's keep talking about how Congress does its work. So starting with the leadership structures. So, and there's some similarities between the House and the Senate, and there's some differences. So let's start with the House. In the House of Representatives, the top leader is the Speaker of the House. This is always a member of the majority party because it's the Speaker of the House is elected by vote within the House of Representatives, and so the majority party isn't going to elect a speaker from the other party, so that's why it's always the Speaker of the House is always going to be a member of the majority party. And then under the Speaker of the House, you've got the majority and minority leaders. Okay, they're the ones who direct debate. They guide their party members in policy-making issues, et cetera, et cetera. And then you got the whips. Okay, these are the folks that render party discipline and make sure that the members of the party are in line with the party goals. Okay, I mean, it's not like actually disciplining them, but it's making just you get persuasive people to make sure everybody's doing the same thing. We're all together and we're doing the same thing. Now, in the Senate, the top leadership position there is the president of the Senate. Now, that also happens to be the vice president of the United States. Okay, so this is a non-voting position I'll tell you about in a second. After the president of the Senate, you've got the president pro tem. Okay, that's the person who presides over the Senate when the VP, the vice president, is away, which happens a lot in modern times. Now, in the Senate, you've got the Senate Majority Leader. This is the one that's much more powerful than the previous 2, than the President Pro Tem and the President of the Senate, which in many ways are just the same thing. It's just one is standing in for the other. So the Senate Majority Leader sets the legislative agenda by determining which bills reach the floor for debate, which is an exceedingly powerful thing to be able to do. And then in the Senate, there's also whips. They do the same thing as the House whips do. Okay, so that's the leadership structure. You also need to understand the main way that Congress gets its job done is through the committee system. Okay, and there's several different types of committees that you're going to need to know. Number 1, standing committees. Okay, these are they're called standing committees because they're just always there. Okay, they don't like pop up, do their job, and then go away. No, they're standing. They're always there. Okay, so example in the Senate, there's the standing committee on the budget. Okay, they're always going to need a budget, so there's always a committee for that. In the House, a good example is the House Judiciary Committee, which handles impeachments, as well as a whole host of other things. And so there's always interaction that needs to happen between Congress and the judicial branch, and so in part that's some of what they do. So those are standing committees. Joint committees, another type of committee. These are groups that involve both House and Senate members. Okay, so you've got the Joint Committee on the Library of Congress. Okay, the relatively uncontroversial one. Library of Congress always needs oversight, funding, whatever, and so there's a joint committee that both House and Senate members work on that. Then there are select committees. Excuse me. Then there are select committees. This is the opposite of a standing committee, okay? So standing committee, always there. Select committees are temporary. They are pulled together for a very specific purpose, okay? Those purposes could be dang near anything. One example would be the select committee was formed to investigate Richard Nixon's involvement in the Watergate scandal. They found he was kind of a turd. He did it all, and that led to his almost impeachment and removal from office. His almost removal from office, I should say. So those are select committees. Then you've got conference committees, okay? So we're going to talk a lot more about how a bill becomes a law in just a second. But in order for a bill to become a law, as I mentioned, it has to pass identical versions in the House and in the Senate. So if that doesn't happen, and they can't get this, they can't agree on how the law should be written, they go to a conference committee in order to hash out the details and get them ironed out. Why did my big idea go away? Where are you at? I don't know. Anyway, we're almost done with this one. All right. So, basic process of a bill becoming a law. A member from the House or the Senate can introduce a bill. They're known as the sponsor. As that bill is considered, it oftentimes, almost always, changes. Sometimes riders are added. Sometimes they are non-germane riders. Sometimes they're germane. Regardless, riders are things that add provisions to bills, which would usually just benefit a Congress member's own agenda, or sometimes these are riders that can help get the bill passed. Also, sometimes pork barrel spending is added, which are funds that are earmarked for special projects in representatives' districts. Again, it's going to help one particular district or maybe a handful. Anyway, the point is, it goes to committee, as they're considering it, it's changing, it's getting riders, it's getting different funding petitions, etc. After all that is done, it's assigned to a committee. A bill is assigned to a committee, and there are 3 stages in that committee. There are hearings, people are just talking about it, and then there's markup, and then there's the reporting out, okay? And then finally, there's the voting, okay? Oftentimes you'll see something going on here called, when a bill comes up for a vote, you'll hear something called log rolling. That's basically, compromise is required to get these laws passed. So representatives will go to other representatives and say, hey, by the way, you vote for my bill, I'll vote for yours, okay? I don't even know what it is. You vote for me, I'll vote for you, okay? So that's log rolling. Now, real quick, last part of this big idea. One of Congress's biggest tasks is to create a budget, okay? And most of the government income comes from income tax, but also, other taxes, tariffs, that sort of thing. And in making that budget, they have to allocate funds for 2 very specific purposes. Number 1, mandatory spending. Number 2, discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is what it sounds like. These are payments that are required by law. So Social Security is a law. Everybody has to, that's withheld from their paychecks. They have to be given that money. That's mandatory spending, not even like, if Congress wakes up one day and is like, I don't know if I feel like giving the Social Security check. They can't do that. It's mandatory. But then there's discretionary spending. That's all the money that's left over after the mandatory spending, and that is, we'll talk more about that with the bureaucracy. So let's move on to big idea number 3. Whew, that was a chunky one. Where are we at? Okay, efficiency. The efficiency with which Congress does its work is affected by ideological divisions, differing conceptions of representation, and redistricting / gerrymandering. Oh my gosh. So, how well does Congress get its job done? How fast does Congress get its job done? Well, lots of factors that go into that. Number 1, ideological divisions. Okay? The big one here is political polarization. So, over the last 30 years, Republicans have become more conservative and Democrats have become more liberal, which makes negotiation and compromise the very heart of what makes our Constitution work. It makes that very difficult. Okay? So, ideological division can greatly slow down the legislation process in Congress. Now, also, there are, as far as how well Congress gets its job done, you have to understand how the representatives themselves think about the way that they work and what their job is. And there's 3 models, okay? Number 1, they can think of themselves as a trustee. Here, the representative believes that, he or she has been entrusted with the public's faith to vote according to their best judgment. Like the representative's best judgments. Like, you elected me, I'm good now, I will exercise my judgment and my wisdom to go vote and to what I think is best, okay? That's the trustee model. Then there's the delegate model. Here, the representative believes that he or she must vote with the will of the people, even if it goes against his or her better judgment. And this is especially true in the House because, they're only around for their terms of 2 years, and they're having to constantly face re-election and, the people that are going to elect them again. And then the third model is Politico. Okay, this is kind of a blend of the other 2. So for the Politico, the representative who sees themselves like this is sort of like, what are they going to do? Well, it depends on the situation. Whatever makes the most sense for each vote, the Politico is going to consider it all. Okay? Maybe go with the will of the people, maybe go with their own wisdom. It's sort of a blend. Now, redistricting and gerrymandering is also, it affects the speed and the efficiency with which Congress does this work. And you've been hearing about this a lot lately. If you didn't go into this course knowing about gerrymandering, baby, you know it now. Because it's getting crazy. But regardless, I'm not here to comment on that. I'm just telling you, it's crazy. So, redistricting, this occurs every 10 years, okay? And that's by means of a census, which is mandated in the Constitution. So, once the census numbers come in, there's new information about where people live. Congressional districts are then redrawn based on population. And this, of course, is a highly contentious issue. Always has been, still is. And things can get even more heated when districts are not reapportioned properly. And for that, let's talk about 2 Supreme Court cases that have addressed this. The first is Baker v. Carr in 1962. So, because Tennessee had not redrawn its districts in a long time, a minority of voters had a majority of the power. And in this case, it was argued that such an arrangement violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the judges on the Supreme Court agreed, and in doing so, they established the one person, one vote principle. So Baker v. Carr, one person, one vote principle, stick it in your brain folds. The second case is Shaw v. Reno in 1993. This was a case about redistricting gone wrong, namely gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is drawing districts in such a way to, benefit one party and disadvantage another, and that can be done with partisan gerrymandering, or it can be done with other criteria in mind. In terms of North Carolina, it was race. Okay, 2 North Carolina districts were drawn in really weird shapes, and they were doing that in order to create majority black districts. And the people who redrew these districts argued that, hey, this is upholding the spirit of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 for historically discriminated people to make sure they have a voice in the government. However, the court ruled that drawing districts solely based on race was unconstitutional based on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. There you go. Shaw v. Reno. All right. Big idea number 4. President, though the president has no constitutional lawmaking power, the president uses formal and informal powers to get the presidential policy agenda passed. All right, let's move on to the president. Y'all feeling good? I've been flapping my mouth hole for a while now. Hope you're feeling good. I'm feeling good. Talk about government. Talking about government. All right. Let's keep talking about government. What are we doing? President. Okay. So the formal and informal powers of the president. So formal powers are granted to the president by Article 2 of the Constitution. There's a few that would be helpful to know. Number 1, the veto. The veto power is given to the president by the Constitution. Remember I said that if a bill is going to become a law, then the last stage in that process is signing. The president must sign that law in order for it to become active. Now, if a law is not in line with the president's policy agenda, then the president has the power, the constitutional power, to veto it. To say, nope, this is not going to become a law. And so, at that point, 2 things can happen. 1, the bill is sent back to Congress, and they can either add or subtract to it to make it more attractive to the president, make it into a signable bill. Or 2, if they don't care about that, Congress can override the veto, the presidential veto, by a 2/3 vote. It's very difficult to do. It has been done on occasion. The president also has powers over foreign policy. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military. However, remember, it is Congress that declares war. So that's another example of the separation of powers and being able to check and balance one another. However, I do have to say that not all deployment of troops means that war is being declared. I mean, the last war that Congress declared was World War II, just so you know. We've had Korea, we've had Vietnam, we've had 2 Iraq wars, Afghanistan, now Iran. We've got all these wars, and none of them were declared by Congress. So what's going on? Well, I've gotten too far into this, but there are laws that say that a president can deploy troops for 60 days, and then 60 days, and then then it requires congressional approval. It's another example. I should get off of this because we got to keep going. But it's another example of the fight or the debate between that we saw in the Federalist Papers when we're talking about the president is, should the president be able to act quickly, which Hamilton was arguing for, or should they be relatively weak and have to submit in obeisance to Congress? And so it's another example of that debate. We should move on. There are other informal powers that the president has. Those are the formal powers. I didn't list all of them, but informal powers are things that are not listed in the Constitution. So things like bargaining and persuasion, right? So the president can use speeches and other forms of communication to persuade the public to get on board with the president's agenda. Also, executive orders. Okay, so this is a directive from the president that has the force of federal law, but it's not actually a law. Okay, because remember, Congress is the only lawmaking body in our form of government. So mainly what an executive order does is it goes towards directing the actions of the federal bureaucracy and the military, which are areas of power given to the president by the Constitution. And sometimes, yeah, okay. Big idea number 5. It's so hard not to just go off and talk about these things. It's so much fun. Okay, we gotta stay disciplined. Number 5, exercise of presidential power can often lead to conflicts with the other branches of government, but those other branches have means of checking the president's power. All right, so let's talk about checking the president's power. So with respects, there's so many different ways, but let's talk about Congress checking executive power through presidential appointments. Okay, when the president is elected, there's so many federal jobs to fill, and many of them have to be approved by the Senate. Okay, for example, cabinet members. The president's cabinet is all led by various secretaries. The Senate has the power of advice and consent, and that means they have the power to approve the presidential cabinet members. Okay, and usually these go unopposed, but in some cases they can be contentious. The president also appoints ambassadors, White House staff. Usually those go unopposed because it's like, the president was elected, let that president choose their staff and that sort of thing. But one of the most contentious appointments that the president has is nominations to federal courts, okay, especially the Supreme Court. This ends up being highly contentious because these folks have lifetime appointments, and that means they have the power to implement the president's policy agenda for a whole lot longer than that person is the president. Okay, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. Actually, that leads us on to big idea number 6. All right, we're getting through these a little quicker after those first 2 beefy ones. Presidential power has grown significantly over time. Yeah, it has. Yeah, it has. Woo. All right. Let's talk about Federalist 70, another required document. So, Federalist 70 is about the nature of the executive office, and especially arguing for a single executive. There were, also other arguments for multiple executives, whatever. In Federalist 70, the argument is basically a single executive is going to have more energy. That was their word for it, energy. They love to talk about the energy of an executive. It means that the president will be able to be decisive and move quick on matters that require firm leadership, snappy decision-making, and that sort of thing. And ultimately, as you probably know, a single executive is exactly what we got. But the power of, the role of the president has expanded over time, depending on, the historical events of the nation. And I would love to give you, just to not do this in 15 seconds, but alas, here we are, this is what it's going to be. So, just a quick run through of how the power of the executive has expanded. So, let's start with our boy George Washington. He was an interesting one because he actually considered himself as a servant of Congress. Okay? Congress is the people's house, so he often deferred to what Congress wanted to do. The next big turning point was Andrew Jackson. Oh my gosh, big shift in presidential power. He believed that he was the representative of the people. Now remember, Congress is the representative of the people, but here comes old Andrew Jackson. He's like, no, I'm the representative of the people, and thus, with that belief in tow, he really expanded the power of the executive office to reflect that very reality. And you see that reflected in the fact that he used the veto 12 times, which after him wasn't that much. But before him, that was more, 12 vetoes was more than any of the 6 previous presidents combined. So there you go, Jackson. He did that, great demonstration of his view of executive power with the Indian Removal Act. The Supreme Court decided that removing American Indians from their lands was unconstitutional, couldn't do it. And then Andrew Jackson was just like, that's nice, I would do it anyway. So remember, he thinks he's the representative of the people. This is what the people want, we're doing it, okay? Big expansion of presidential power. Then we're going to skip a few and get to Abraham Lincoln. He also expanded the executive office. He assumed a whole lot more powers in order to save the Union during the Civil War and abolish slavery. For example, he suspended during the Civil War, he suspended the right of habeas corpus and several other things that my mind is blanking on right now. Point is, in order to prosecute the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln stuck his hand right into the glove of executive power and forced that thing to get about 5 sizes bigger. Now, you can argue, hey, the Civil War, he needed to do it. Whatever, the point is, he made it much bigger. Then the next big step was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. And, you know, if there was ever a president who enlarged executive power, it was Franklin D. Roosevelt, okay? Man had 635 vetoes, okay? Just for comparison, most modern presidents veto less than 100 times. Man vetoed 635 times. And, you know, it was the Great Depression. He was responding to a massive economic crisis. And so, he put his New Deal programs into place and, pushed through Congress in order to address the Great Depression. But regardless, in doing so, the president, he fundamentally remade the nature of executive power and expanded the power of the executive beyond anybody before him. And that's going to lead us to big idea number 7. So because of their unique command of the attention of Americans, presidents have often used new communication technologies to appeal directly to the people. You see, that's what the president has going for them, is that the president actually, it's so hard. A lot of Americans don't know who their congressional representatives are. They might not be able to name the Supreme Court justices, whatever. But everybody knows who the president is, right? That's the one thing the president has going for them, is that everyone knows who they are, okay? And so smart presidents use that to their advantage, okay? So presidents, over time, like, their means of communication with the public has changed along with technology. So, you got George Washington, who delivered the State of the Union address in person, and then it was printed in newspapers for everyone to read. Then fast forward to Franklin Roosevelt. He made use of a new widespread technology at that point, the radio, and he gave right when he was first elected, everybody is suffering profoundly in the Great Depression, and so he uses the medium of radio, and he sits down for what he calls fireside chats, and he just talks to people through the radio. The actual stinking president talking to me in my living room. Not me. I'm not that old. I wasn't around then. But regardless, it was like the president is actually addressing us. Like it was a massive thing. So, then fast forward to John F. Kennedy a few years later, and he was the first one to use television, or I should say live press conferences on television. He wasn't the first president on television, but he really made use of live press conferences. In doing so, he created the communication office of the president, and they would work to refine and to shape the presidential talking points so that the president's policy agenda would succeed in the minds of the hearts and the people of Americans to whom he was addressing. Now, with the advent of new media like social media, the internet, etc., this is a huge innovation, because now the president has a way to speak, directly to the people without the filtering of journalists, like in newspaper or whatever. Now presidents talk directly to their followers, and that has been a massive innovation. Okay, and that's going to lead us to big idea number 8. The Supreme Court checks the other branches of government through the power of judicial review. Judicial review. Okay. We're going to start with Federalist 78. So Federalist 78 was written by our boy Alexander Hamilton, and he argued that, the independence of the judicial branch, which occurs through lifetime appointments of the judges, those lifetime appointments act as a protection for the power of those judges. He argued that the court actually had the right of judicial review. And judicial review basically is the court decides whether a law passed by Congress, signed by the president, is constitutional or not. And if it's not constitutional, it is no longer have the force of law. Okay? Now, this is a lot of the court's power was hashed out in a case from 1803 called Marbury v. Madison. Sorry, I heard something running around upstairs. Marbury v. Madison, 1803. It has to do, it's kind of complicated. Here's the basic thing you need to remember about it. it basically just established the power of judicial review for the court. Okay, the power of judicial review not in the Constitution. Actually, it's like they were all sweaty in Philadelphia when they were writing the Constitution. They got to the end and they were like, yeah, Supreme Court, yeah, y'all figure it out later. There's not much in there in the Constitution about the Supreme Court, and so the court has had to sort of carve out and define its own power constitutionally. One of the ways they've done that is by embracing the power of judicial review. Not embracing it, it was sort of in the nature of the branch itself. And that occurred through Marbury v. Madison. Okay? Now, real quick, the structure of the federal court system, you're going to need to know there are 3 levels. Okay? You've got the U.S. District Courts, you've got the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's the order in which they go. District Courts, Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court. So all the judges in these courts are appointed by the president, which means that they are confirmed by the Senate, and they hold lifetime appointments on the condition that they don't
Dice
turn out to be
30
adjourned,
minutos.
in a row. And if they have good behavior, then they will always be on the bench until they retire or die. And that brings us to big idea number 9. The combination of the court's exercise of judicial review and the life tenure of judges leads some to question the legitimacy of the court. Okay, so here's how the court works. There's a couple things that are very important to court rulings. Number 1 is the role of precedents. Precedents, not presidents. Precedents. So precedents are very hard to overturn. Okay, a precedent is basically, we've decided on an issue in the past, that's the precedent. It's very hard to overturn that. The reason why it's so hard to overturn that is because of the principle of stare decisis. The literal meaning of that is let the decision stand. That is sort of the court's natural resting posture. If we've decided something in the past, we're just going to let it stand. Let it be. Okay, we're not going to hash this up. Now, so that means when a precedent is overturned, it's a real big deal. Okay, we'll talk about how Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned with Brown v. the Board of Education tomorrow night. But it's a big deal when those get overturned. But ideological changes can also affect the kinds of decisions the court makes. So, the president is the one who appoints judges, and because of that, the president is going to choose judges that align with the president's own ideological commitments. And so, if the president is conservative, that president is going to appoint conservative judges, and the same thing on the liberal side. And so that has a role. That particular process plays a role in whether the court is going to remain bound to previous precedents or create new ones, right? So if a group of conservative justices pass this particular precedent, and now if the court is full of liberal justices, it might play a role in whether or not they decide to overturn that older precedent, or vice versa, whatever it is. Now, the last part of this big idea is that controversial decisions can lead people to challenge the court's legitimacy. In other words, the court invalidates a law or upholds a law, and people look at it and they're like, what is a bunch of unelected judges, and they're like telling us what the law is and what not. We can't even hold them accountable. So when controversial decisions come down, it has a way of making people question the legitimacy of the court. And I'll just give you one example, and that's Roe v. Wade in 1973. It's not a required case, but it's not on your list of required cases, but it is in the curriculum, and it is worth knowing. So Roe v. Wade, very simple, 1973, essentially legalized abortion in all 50 states. That led to very significant backlash among states with conservative majorities who argued that the court did not have the right to impose the practice of abortion on them, right? So that conflict raged on for decades, but then it can be seen again in 2022 when a case actually overturned that decision, the Roe decision. In 2022, it was Dobbs v. Jackson, which gave back to the states the authority to make laws about abortion. And, at that, the same thing happened, the same kind of controversy happened except from the other side. Like, states with liberal majorities attacked the legitimacy of the Supreme Court for removing what had been a constitutional right for almost 50 years, okay? So, over time, judges are going to, judges come and go, but they're usually going to make their decisions according to one of two sort of judicial postures, and you have to know both of these. Number one, they can decide according to judicial activism. This is when the court decides to basically establish policy. They're considering the broad effects of a decision on society. And there can be liberal activism, there can be conservative activism, and anywhere in between. Good example there is the overturning of Plessy v. Ferguson and the separate but equal doctrine that I just mentioned a second ago. So that's judicial activism. Judges are sort of like considering how this policy is going to make waves in society. The other side is judicial restraint. The idea here is that judges are, when they think of themselves, they're like, judges aren't appointed to make policy. The elected legislature is supposed to do that. The only time that a law should be struck down is if it violates the actual written word of the Constitution. So they're literalists in a sense, okay? So that's judicial restraint. All right, big idea number 10. Here we go. The federal bureaucracy carries out the responsibilities of the federal government under the authority of the executive branch. Oh, baby, the bureaucracy. Oh my gosh, this is so much to say here. We'll go through it quickly. So the structure of the bureaucracy is basically you've got first of all, what is it? The bureaucracy is essentially the millions of workers, agencies, departments, all sorts of things that make up the executive branch, right? So the Congress passes laws, president signs them into law, says, yeah, I'll be the guy to make sure these laws happen. But the president can't actually make sure the laws happen. There's so many people in the country, so there's this massive bureaucracy that works for the president that makes sure that the laws get that the laws are executed and obeyed. So the structure of the bureaucracy you're going to need to understand. First of all, there's the cabinet secretaries. They're up there on the highest level. What were we talking about? Cabinet secretaries, that's right. So they're the highest levels. They're the leaders of the 15 executive departments, like the Department of Energy, the Homeland Security. The biggest by far is the Department of Defense, etc. Now, these departments are then further subdivided into agencies, and all of those work together to make sure that the goals of the department are accomplished. So those are the cabinets. Those are the highest level ones. Then you've got commissions. These are independent regulatory groups that operate, kind of independently of the authority of the president, but they still fall under executive authority. And commissions are generally created for a very specific purpose. Like, for example, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. They regulate the content of media, which is, they're not censoring it, but they're just making sure that nothing inappropriate is displayed. They were created in order to do that very specific job. So you've got cabinet, you've got commissions, and then under that, we've got government corporations. This is sort of like a hybrid of a business and a government agency for when, you need some of the benefits of the private world mixed with some of the resources and oversight of the government world. Good example here is the Postal Service. That is a government corporation. Okay. That's the basic structure of how the bureaucracy works. Now, what does the bureaucracy do? They write and enforce legislation. If they find people not obeying the law, they will issue fines for those violations. They also have to go to Congress and interact with Congress in order to make sure that everybody is complying with everything, testify before Congress. Sometimes that's contentious. Sometimes it's just nice and informational, and everywhere in between. Now, these entities, the corporations and the committees, and no, not the committees, the commissions, etc., they will often work very closely with other entities. And so when agencies, congressional committees, and interest groups develop a relationship, that is known as an iron triangle. Okay, so agencies, congressional committees, and interest groups. When they're working together, that is an iron triangle. These three work together and rely on each other to create policy. And it's a nice little political, hug fest going on over there. Now, that leads us to big idea number 11. The federal bureaucracy uses delegated discretionary authority for rulemaking and implementation. Okay, this is an easy one, the short. So you have to know delegated discretionary authority, a lovely set of words. Basically, that describes the authority that's given to the bureaucracy by Congress that gives them the discretion on how to make the rules and carry out the laws. So this authority is given to various bureaucratic agencies by Congress. And there are 7 of these agencies you need to know. I'm going to run through them real quick. You have to know the Department of Homeland Security. This is the one that maintains and controls U.S. borders. You've got the Department of Transportation, which manages all kinds of transportation, like highways and air travel, etc. You've got the Department of Veterans Affairs, which manages veterans hospitals, essentially the general welfare of Americans' veterans. Then you've got the Department of Education. This manages state implementation of federal educational standards, which has gotten more complicated over time. Then you've got the Environmental Protection Agency. I don't even know what number we're on. Is that 5? I don't know. You got the Environmental Protection Agency, which protects the environment and human health by passing, very specific regulations for businesses on what they can and cannot do in terms of pollutants into the environment. Then you've got the Federal Elections Commission, which is a body that oversees campaign finance laws. And then you've got the circuit. I can't. I gotta breathe. Talking too fast. Woo. Those words just got. I felt actual words in my mouth tumbling all around. What a thing. Let's just chill. Let's be calm. All right. What were we talking about? Security and Exchange Commission. They regulate the stock market. They prevent fraud, etc. Now, point is, Congress passes very broad, unspecific laws. And it's up to these agencies to interpret those laws and then make more specific rules to execute those laws, okay, and to make sure that everyone is compliant with them. And that leads us to big idea number 12. Last big idea for the night. Last big idea. The Bill of Rights protects individual liberties. All right, that is not the big idea. Wait.
That's in that next video.
It's something about big idea number is something about bureaucracy. I think it's about the bureaucracy checking how the bureaucracy is checked. Okay, I'll have to change that. Sorry. It should be right on your notes if you downloaded the notes in the description. Anyway, so how the bureaucracy gets checked. Well, the bureaucracy, as I mentioned, is the enforcing tool of the executive branch, but their power can be checked by congressional oversight. So Congress has a whole lot of committees that correspond to the government agencies that will call, the directors of those agencies over to testify and give reports on their progress. Sometimes these are friendly, sometimes they are not, and they're very ugly. But regardless, those agency heads have to answer to Congress. Also, Congress, remember, holds the power of the purse. So they can decide how to allocate funds to different agencies, and those agencies can't spend money until a committee or a subcommittee authorizes them to do so. And so that's a very significant way that that Congress can check the bureaucracy. But also, the executive, the president, can check the bureaucracy. So here's, it's executive accountability, basically. This is the bureaucracy is the executive's sort of staff, workforce. So this is the first line of defense against an unwieldy bureaucracies. So, you know, for example, President Clinton, Bill Clinton, initiated a national performance review in which the various agencies were required to scrutinize and change, you know, if necessary, its mission and objectives, if they weren't in line with the agenda of the president. And then the judicial branch can check the
Wasn't even that bad. It was just I'm just
bureaucracy
tired.
as well. So, you know, when citizens believe that bureaucratic decisions are unconstitutional, they can challenge those decisions, those rules, those regulations in court. And, you know, usually
don't
unless
think that's how-
the agencies are just blatantly violating the law, the court upholds the authority oftentimes of the agency, but still it can be challenged in court.